Chapter 27. Jafur was so small, and its coffle of diligent new men so numerous, it soon seemed to Kunta that nearly every roof, wall, calabash, and cooking pot in the village had been inspected, cleaned, repaired, or replaced moments before he got to it. But he was more pleased than disappointed, for it gave him more time to spend farming the small plot assigned to his use by the Council of Elders. All new men grew their own couscous or groundnuts, some to live on and the rest to trade, with those who grew too little to feed their families for things they needed more than food. A young man who tended his crops well made good trades and managed his goats wisely, perhaps swapping a dozen goats for a female calf that would grow up and have other calves, could move ahead in the world and become a man of substance by the time he reached 25 or 30 reigns, and began to think about taking a wife and raising sons of his own. Within a few moons after his return, Kunta had grown so much more than he could eat himself, and made such shrewd trades for this or that household possession to adorn his hut, that Binta began to grumble about it within his hearing. He had so many stools, wicker mats, food bowls, gourds, and sundry other objects in his hut, she would mutter that there was hardly any room left inside for Kunta. But he charitably chose to ignore her impertinence, since he slept now upon a fine bed of woven reeds over a springy bamboo mattress that she had spent half a moon making for him. In his hut, along with several safis he had acquired in exchange for crops from his farm plot, he kept a number of other potent spiritual safeguards, the perfumed extracts of certain plants and barks which, like every other Mandinka man, Kunta rubbed onto his forehead, upper arms, and thighs each night before going to bed. It was believed that this magical essence would protect a man from possession by evil spirits while he slept. It would also make him smell good, a thing that, along with his appearance, Kunta had begun to think about. He and the rest of his Kafa were becoming increasingly exasperated about a matter that had been rankling their manly pride for many moons. When they went off to manhood training, they had left behind a group of skinny, giggling, silly little girls who played almost as hard as the boys. Then, after only 4 moons away, they had returned, as new men, to find these same girls, with whom they had grown up, flouncing about wherever one looked, poking out their mango-sized breasts, tossing their heads and arms, showing off their jangly new earrings, beads, and bracelets. What irritated Kunta and the others wasn't so much that the girls were behaving so absurdly, but that they seemed to be doing so exclusively for the benefit of men at least 10 reigns older than themselves. For new men like Kunta, these maidens of marriageable age, 14 and 15, had scarcely a glance except to sneer or laugh. He and his mates finally grew so disgusted with these airs and antics that they resolved to pay no further attention either to the girls or to the all-too-willing older men they sought to entice with such fluttery coyness. But Kunta's photo would be as hard as his thumb some mornings when he waked. Of course, it had been hard many times before, even when he was Laman's age, but now it was much different in the feeling, very deep and strong. And Kunta couldn't help putting his hand down under his bed cover and tightly squeezing it. He also couldn't help thinking about things he and his mates had overheard, about photos being put into women. One night dreaming, for ever since he was a small boy, Kunta had dreamed a great deal. Even when he was awake, Binta liked to say he found himself watching a harvest festival Seruba, when the loveliest, longest-necked, sootiest black maiden there chose to fling down her head wrap for him to pick up. When he did so, she rushed home shouting, "Kunta likes me," and after careful consideration, her parents gave permission for them to marry. Omoro and Binta also agreed, and both fathers bargained for the bride price. "She is beautiful," said Omoro, "but my concerns are of her true value as my son's wife. Is she a strong, hard worker? Is she of pleasant disposition in the home? Can she cook well and care for children? And above all, is she guaranteed a virgin?" The answers were all yes, so a price was decided and a date set for the wedding. Kunta built a fine new mud house, and both mothers cooked bountiful delicacies to give guests the best impression. And on the wedding day, the adults, children, goats, chickens, dogs, parrots, and monkeys all but drowned out the musicians they had hired. When the bride's party arrived, the praise singer shouted of the fine families being joined together. Yet louder shouts rose when the bride's best girlfriends roughly shoved her inside Kunta's new house. Grinning and waving to everyone, Kunta followed her and drew the curtain across the door. When she had seated herself on his bed, he sang to her a famous ancestral song of love. "Mendumbi, your long neck is very beautiful." Then they lay down on soft cured hides, and she kissed him tenderly, and they clung together very tightly. And then the thing happened, as Kunta had come to imagine it from the ways it had been described to him. It was even greater than he had been told, and the feeling grew and grew, until finally he burst. Jerking suddenly awake, Kunta lay very still for a long moment, trying to figure out what had happened. Then, moving his hand down between his legs, he felt the warm wetness on himself and on his bed. Frightened and alarmed, he leapt up, felt for a cloth, and wiped himself off, and the bed too. Then, sitting there in the darkness, his fear was slowly overtaken by embarrassment, his embarrassment by shame, his shame by pleasure, and his pleasure, finally, by a kind of pride. Had this ever happened to any of his mates, he wondered? Though he hoped it had, he also hoped it hadn't, for perhaps this is what happens when one really becomes a man, he thought, and he wanted to be the first. But Kunta knew that he would never know, for this experience and even these thoughts weren't the kind he could ever share with anyone. Finally, exhausted and exhilarated, he lay down again and soon fell into a mercifully dreamless sleep. Chapter 28. Kunta knew every man, woman, child, dog, and goat in Jafur, he told himself one afternoon while he sat eating lunch beside his plot of groundnuts. And in the course of his new duties, he either saw or spoke with almost all of them nearly every day. Why, then, did he feel so alone? Was he an orphan? Did he not have a father who treated him as one man should another? Did he not have a mother who tended dutifully to his needs? Did he not have brothers to look up to him? As a new man, was he not their idol? Did he not have the friendship of those with whom he had played in the mud as children, herded goats as boys, returned to Jafur as men? Had he not earned the respect of his elders, and the envy of his kafo mates, for husbanding his farm plot into 7 goats, 3 chickens, and a splendidly furnished hut before reaching his 16th birthday? He couldn't deny it. And yet he was lonely. Omoro was too busy to spend even as much time with Kunta as he did when he had only one son and fewer responsibilities in the village. Binta was busy too, taking care of Kunta's younger brothers, but his mother and he had little to say to one another anyway. Even he and Lamin were no longer close. While he had been away at the Jujuo, Suwadu had become Lamin's adoring shadow as Lamin had once been Kunta's, and Kunta watched with mixed emotions, while Lamin's attitude toward his little brother warmed from irritation to toleration to affection. Soon they were inseparable, and this had left as little room for Kunta as it had for Madi, who was too young yet to join them, but old enough to whine because they wouldn't let him. On days when the two older brothers couldn't get out of their mother's hut fast enough, of course, Binta would often order them to take Madi along, so that she could get him out from underfoot, and Kunta would have to smile in spite of himself at the thought of his 3 brothers marching around the village, one behind the other, in the order of their births, with the 2 in front staring glumly ahead while the little one, smiling happily, brought up the rear, almost running to keep up. No one walked behind Kunta any longer, and not often did anyone choose to walk beside him either, for his kafo mates were occupied almost every waking hour with their new duties, and, perhaps, like him, with their own broodings about what had so far proved to be the dubious rewards of manhood. True, they had been given their own farm plots and were beginning to collect goats and other possessions, but the plots were small, the work hard, and their possessions were embarrassingly few in comparison to those of older men. They had also been made the eyes and ears of the village, but the cooking pots were kept clean without their supervision, and nothing ever trespassed in the fields, except occasional baboon families or dense flocks of birds. Their elders, it soon became clear, got to do all the really important jobs, and as if to rub it in, gave the new men only what they felt was the appearance of respect, as they had been given only the appearance of responsibility. Indeed, when they paid any attention at all to the younger men, the elders seemed to have as much difficulty as the young girls of the village in restraining themselves from laughter, even when one of them performed the most challenging task without a mistake. Well, someday he would be one of those older men, Kunta told himself, and he would wear the mantle of manhood not only with more dignity, but also with more compassion and understanding toward younger men than he and his mates received now. Feeling restless and a little sorry for himself, that evening Kunta left his hut to take a solitary walk. Though he had no destination in mind, his feet drew him toward the circle of rapt children's faces glowing in the light of the campfire, around which the old grandmothers were telling their nightly stories to the first kafo of the village. Stopping close enough to listen, but not close enough to be noticed listening, Kunta squatted down on his haunches and pretended to be inspecting a rock at his feet, while one of the wrinkled old women waved her skinny arms and jumped around the clearing in front of the children as she acted out her story of the 4,000 brave warriors of the King of Kassoon, who had been driven into battle by the thunder of 500 great war drums and the trumpeting of 500 elephant tusk horns. It was a story he had heard many times around the fires as a child, and as he looked at the wide-eyed faces of his Madi in the front row and Suwadu in the back row, it somehow made him feel sad to hear it again. With a sigh, he rose and walked slowly away, his departure as unnoticed as his arrival had been. At the fire where Lamin sat with other boys his age chanting their Quranic verses, and the fire where Binta sat with other mothers gossiping about husbands, households, children, cooking, sewing, makeup, and hairdos, he felt equally unwelcome. Passing them by, he found himself finally beneath the spreading branches of the baobab, where the men of Jafur sat around the 4th fire discussing village business and other matters of gravity. As he had felt too old to be wanted around the 1st fire, he felt too young to be wanted around this one, but he had no place else to go, so Kunta seated himself among those in the outer circle, beyond those of Amoro's age, who sat closer to the fire, and those of the Kintango's age, who sat closest, among the council of elders. As he did so, he heard one of them ask, "Can anyone say how many of us are getting stolen?" They were discussing slave-taking, which had been the main subject around the men's fire for more than 100 rains that Tubob had been stealing people and shipping them in chains to the kingdom of white cannibals across the sea. There was silence for a little while, and then the Alimamo said, We can only thank Allah that it's less now than it was. There are fewer of us left to steal, said an angry elder. I listen to the drums and count the lost, said the Kintango. 50 to 60 each new moon, just from along our part of the Bolong would be my guess. No one said anything to that, and he added, there is no way, of course, to count the losses farther inland and farther up the river. Why do we count only those taken away by the Tubab? Asked the Arafang. We must count also the burned baobabs where villages once stood. He has killed more in fires and in fighting him than he has ever taken away. The men stared at the fire for a long time, and then another elder broke the silence. Tubab could never do this without help from our own people. Mandinkas, Fulas, Wolofs, Jolas. None of the Gambia's tribes is without its Slatey traders. As a child, I saw these Slateys beating those like themselves to walk faster for the Tubab. For Tubab money, we turn against our own kind, said Jafur's senior elder. Greed and treason, these are the things Tubab has given us in exchange for those he has stolen away. No one talked again for a while, and the fire sputtered quietly. Then the Kintango spoke again. Even worse than Tubab's money is that he lies for nothing and he cheats with method, as naturally as he breathes. That's what gives him the advantage over us. A few moments passed, and then a young man of the Kafo ahead of Kunta's asked, will Tubab never change? That will be, said one of the elders, when the river flows backward. Soon the fire was a pile of smoking embers, and the men began to get up, stretch themselves, wish one another good night, and head home to their huts. But 5 young men in the 3rd Kafo stayed behind, one to cover with dust the warm ashes of all the fires, and the rest, including Kunta, to take the late shift as village lookouts beyond each corner of Jafur's high bamboo fence. After such alarming talk around the fire, Kunta knew he would have no trouble staying awake, but he didn't look forward to spending this particular night beyond the safety of the village. Ambling through Jafur and out the gate with what he hoped was nonchalance, Kunta waved to his fellow guards and made his way along the outside of the fence, past the sharp thorned bushes piled thickly against it, and the pointed stakes concealed beneath them, to a leafy hiding place that afforded him a silvery view of the surrounding countryside on this moonlit night. Getting as comfortable as he could, he slung his spear across his lap, drew up his knees, clasped his arms around them for warmth, and settled in for the night. Scanning the bush with straining eyes for any sign of movement, he listened to the shrilling of crickets, the eerie whistling of night birds, the distant howling of hyenas, and the shrieks of unwary animals taken by surprise, and he thought about the things the men had said around the fire. When dawn came without an incident, he was almost as surprised that he hadn't been set upon by slave stealers as he was to realize that for the first time in a moon he hadn't spent a moment worrying about his personal problems. Are you enjoying this reading so far? Welcome to Right Here Audio, the group run by students for students who wish they had someone to read academic literature to them. We read content for anyone who has a hard time reading by themselves. This includes persons with blindness, dyslexia, ADHD, and anyone else who could use some support. Do you have anything you would like us to read for you? Comment down below and we'll get started. For those of you who have supported us since day one, we are so grateful for your support. And if you're new or haven't subscribed yet, join our small community dedicated to increasing accessibility one small step at a time. Now, let's get back to our reading. Chapter 29. Nearly every day, it seemed to Kunta, Binta would irritate him about something. It wasn't anything she would do or say, but in other ways, little looks, certain tones of voice. Kunta could tell she disapproved of something about him. It was worst when Kunta added to his possessions new things that Binta hadn't obtained for him herself. One morning, arriving to serve his breakfast, Binta nearly dropped the steaming couscous upon Kunta. When she saw he was wearing his first dundiko not sewn with her own hands. Feeling guilty for having traded a cured hyena hide to get it, Kunta angrily offered her no explanation, though he could feel that his mother was deeply hurt. From that morning on, he knew that Binta never brought his meals without her eyes raking every item in his hut to see if there was anything else, a stool, a mat, a bucket, a plate, or a pot, that she'd had nothing to do with. If something new had appeared, Binta's sharp eyes would never miss it. Kunta would sit there fuming while she put on that look of not caring and not noticing that he had seen her wear so many times around Moro, who knew as well as Kunta did that Binta could hardly wait to get to the village well among her women friends so that she could loudly bemoan her troubles, which was what all Mandinka women did when they disagreed with their husbands. One day, before his mother arrived with the morning meal, Kunta picked up a beautifully woven basket that Jina Mbaki, one of Jafour's several widows, had given him as a gift, and he set it just inside the door of his hut, where his mother would be sure to all but stumble over it. The widow was actually a little younger than Binta, it occurred to him. While Kunta was still a second Kafo goatherd, her husband had gone away to hunt and never returned. She lived quite near Nyoboto, whom Kunta often visited, and that was how he and the widow had seen each other and come to speak to each other as Kunta had grown older. It had annoyed Kunta when the widow's gift caused some of Kunta's friends to tease him about her reason for giving him a valuable bamboo basket. When Binta arrived at his hut and saw it, recognizing the widow's style of weaving, she flinched as if the basket were a scorpion before managing to compose herself. She didn't say a word about it, of course, but Kunta knew he had made his point. He was no longer a boy, and it was time for her to stop acting like his mother. He felt it was his own responsibility to change her in that regard. It wasn't something to speak to Amora about, for Kunta knew he couldn't put himself into the ridiculous position of asking Amoro's advice on how to make Binta respect her son the same as she did her husband. Kunta thought about discussing his problem with Nyoboto, but changed his mind when he recalled how peculiarly she had acted toward him upon his return from manhood training. So Kunta kept his own counsel, and before long he decided not to go any more into Binta's hut, where he had lived most of his life. And when Binta brought his meals, he would sit stiffly silent while she set his food on the mat before him, and left without speaking or even looking at him. Kunta finally began thinking seriously of seeking out some new eating arrangement. Most of the other new young men still ate from their mother's kitchens, but some were cooked for by an older sister or a sister-in-law. If Binta got any worse, Kunta told himself he was going to find some other woman to cook for him, perhaps the widow who had given him the woven basket. He knew without asking that she would gladly cook for him, and yet Kunta didn't want to let her know that he was even considering such a thing. In the meantime, he and his mother continued to meet at mealtimes and to act as if they didn't even see each other. Early one morning, returning from a night of sentry duty out in the groundnut fields, Kunta saw hurrying along the trail some distance ahead of him 3 young men whom he could tell were about his own age, and whom he knew had to be travelers from somewhere else. Shouting until they turned around, he kept running to meet and greet them. They told Kunta they were from the village of Bara, a day and a night of walking from Jafour, and they were on their way to hunt for gold. They were of the Filup tribe, which was a branch of Mandinka, but he had to listen carefully to understand them, as they did to understand him. It made Kunta remember his visit with his father to his uncle's new village, where he couldn't understand what some people were saying, although they lived only 2 or 3 days away from Jafur. Kunta was intrigued by the trip the young men were taking. He thought it might also interest some of his friends, so he asked the young men to stop in his village for a day of hospitality before they went on, but they graciously refused the invitation, saying that they had to reach the place where the gold could be panned by the 3rd afternoon of travel. "But why don't you come along with us?" one of the young men asked Kunta. Never having dreamed of such a thing, Kunta was so taken aback that he found himself saying no, telling them that as much as he appreciated the offer, he had much work to do on his farm, as well as other duties, and the 3 young men expressed their regret. "If you should change your mind, please join us," one said, and they got down on their knees and drew in the dust to show Kunta where the gold hunting place was located, about 2 days and nights of travel beyond Jafur. The father of one of the boys, a traveling musician, had told them where it was. Kunta walked along talking with his newfound friends until they came to where the traveler's trail forked. After the 3 men took the fork that led on past Jafur and turned to wave back at him, Kunta walked slowly home. He was thinking hard as he entered his hut and lay down on his bed, and though he had been awake all night, he still couldn't seem to fall asleep. Perhaps he might go to hunt gold after all, if he could find a friend to tend his farm plot. And he knew that someone of his mates would take over his sentry duties if they were only asked, as he would gladly do if they asked him. Kunta's next thought hit him so hard it made him leap right up out of bed. As a man now, he could take Lamin along, as his father had once taken him. For the next hour, Kunta paced the dirt floor of his hut, his mind wrestling with the questions raised by this exciting thought. First of all, would Amaro permit such a trip for Lamin, who was yet a boy and thus required his father's approval? It galled Kunta enough, as a man, to have to ask permission for anything. But suppose Amaro said no, and how would his 3 new friends feel about it if he showed up with his little brother? Come to think of it, Kunta wondered why he was pacing the floor and risking serious embarrassment just to do a favor for Lamin. After all, ever since he had returned from manhood training, Lamin hadn't even been that close to him anymore. But Kunta knew that this wasn't something that either of them wanted. They had really enjoyed each other before Kunta went away, but now Lamin's time was taken up by Suwadu, who was always hanging around his bigger brother in the same way that Lamin used to hang around Kunta, full of pride and admiration. But Kunta felt that Lamin had never quit feeling that way about him. If anything, he felt that Lamin admired his big brother even more than before. It was just that some kind of distance had come between them because of his having become a man. Men simply spent no great deal of time with boys, and even if that wasn't as he and Lamin wanted it, there just seemed no way for either of them to crack through it, until Kunta thought of taking Lamin along on his gold hunting trip. Lamin is a good boy, he displays his home training well, and he takes good care of my goats, was Kunta's opening comment to Amaro, for Kunta knew that men almost never began conversations directly with what they meant to discuss. Amaro, of course, knew this too. He nodded slowly and replied, "Yes, I would say that is true." As calmly as he could, Kunta then told his father of meeting his 3 new friends and of their invitation to join them in hunting for gold. Taking a deep breath, Kunta said finally, "I've been thinking that Lamin might enjoy the trip." Amaro's face showed not a flicker of expression. A long moment passed before he spoke. "For a boy to travel is good," he said, and Kunta knew that his father was at least not going to say no absolutely. In some way, Kunta could feel his father's trust in him, but also his concern, which he knew Amaro didn't want to express any more strongly than he had to. It has been rains since I've had any travel in that area." "I seem not to remember that trail's route very well," said Amaro, as casually as if they were merely discussing the weather. Kunta knew that his father, whom Kunta had never known to forget anything, was trying to find out if he knew the route to the gold hunting place. Dropping onto his knees in the dust, Kunta drew the trail with a stick as if he had known it for years. He drew circles to show the villages that were both near the trail and at some distance from it along the way. Amaro got down onto his knees as well, and when Kunta had finished drawing the trail, said, "I would go so as to pass close by the most villages. It will take a little longer, but it will be the safest." Kunta nodded, hoping that he appeared more confident than he suddenly felt. The thought hit him that though the three friends he had met, traveling together, could catch each other's mistakes, if they made any, he, traveling with a younger brother for whom he would be responsible, would have no one to help if something went wrong. Then Kunta saw Amaro's finger circling the last third of the trail. "In this area, few speak Mandinka," Amaro said. Kunta remembered the lessons of his manhood training and looked into his father's eyes. "The sun and the stars will tell me the way," he said. A long moment passed, and then Amaro spoke again. "I think I'll go by your mother's house." Kunta's heart leapt. He knew it was his father's way of saying that his permission was given, and he felt it best that he personally make his decision known to Binta. Amaro wasn't long in Binta's hut. He had hardly left to return to his own when she burst out her door, hands pressed tightly to her shaking head. "Madi! Suadu!" she shrieked, and they came rushing to her from among the other children. Now other mothers came from their huts, and unmarried girls, all rushing behind Binta as she began hollering and pulling the two boys alongside her toward the well. Once there, all of the women crowded about her as she wept and moaned that now she had only 2 children left, that her others certainly would be lost to Tubob. A second Kafo girl, unable to contain the news of Kunta's trip with Lamin, raced all the way out to where the boys of her Kafo were grazing the goats. A short time later, back in the village, heads jerked around with smiles on their faces as a deliriously joyful boy came whooping into the village in a manner fit to wake the ancestors. Catching up with his mother just outside her hut, Lamin, though still a hand's span shorter than her, bear-hugged Binta, planted big kisses on her forehead, and swept her whirling up off her feet as she shouted to be put down. Once back on the ground, she ran to pick up a nearby piece of wood and struck Lamin with it. She would have done it again, but he dashed away, feeling no pain, toward Kunta's hut. He didn't even knock as he burst inside. It was an unthinkable intrusion into a man's house, but after a glimpse at his brother's face, Kunta had to overlook it. Lamin just stood there, looking up into the face of his big brother. The boy's mouth was trying to say something. Indeed, his whole body was trembling, and Kunta had to catch himself to keep from grabbing and hugging Lamin in the rush of love he felt passing between them in that moment. Kunta heard himself speaking, his tone almost gruff. "I see you've already heard. We'll leave tomorrow after first prayer." Man or not, Kunta took care to walk nowhere near Binta as he made several quick calls to see friends about caring for his farm and filling in for him on sentry duty. Kunta could tell where Binta was from the sound of her wailing as she marched around the village holding Madi and Suwadu by the hand. "These 2 only I have left," she cried, as loudly as she could. But like everyone else in Jafur, she knew that no matter what she felt or said or did, Amaro had spoken. Chapter 30. At the traveler's tree, Kunta prayed for their journey to be a safe one. So that it would be a prosperous one as well, he tied the chicken he had brought along to a lower branch by one of its legs, leaving it flapping and squawking there as he and Lamin set forth on the trail. Though he didn't turn back to look, Kunta knew Lamin was trying very hard to keep pace with him, and to keep his head load balanced, and to keep Kunta from noticing either. After an hour, the trail took them by a low, spreading tree strung thickly with beads. Kunta wanted to explain to Lamin how such a tree meant that living nearby were some of the few Mandinkas who were Kafirs, pagan unbelievers who used snuff and smoked tobacco in pipes made of wood with earthen bowls, and also drank a beer they made of mead. But more important than that knowledge was for Lamin to learn the discipline of silent marching. By noontime, Kunta knew that Lamin's feet and legs would be hurting him badly, and also his neck under the heavy head load. But it was only by keeping on despite pain that a boy could toughen his body and his spirit. At the same time, Kunta knew that Lamin must stop for rest before he collapsed, which would hurt his pride. Taking the bypass trail to miss the first village they passed, they soon shook off the naked little first Kafo children who raced out to inspect them. Kunta still didn't look back, but he knew that Lamin would have quickened his pace and straightened his back for the children's benefit. But as they left the children and the village behind, Kunta's mind drifted off Lamin to other things. He thought again of the drum he was going to make for himself, making it first in his mind, as the men did who carved out masks and figures. For the drum's head, he had a young goat skin already scraped and curing in his hut, and he knew just the place, only a short trot beyond the women's rice fields, where he could find the tough wood he needed for a strong drum frame. Kunta could almost hear how his drum was going to sound. As the trail took them into a grove of trees close by the path, Kunta tightened his grip on the spear he carried, as he had been taught to do. Cautiously, he continued walking, then stopped and listened very quietly. Lamin stood wide-eyed behind him, afraid to breathe. A moment later, however, his big brother relaxed and began walking again, toward what Kunta recognized, with relief, as the sound of several men singing a working song. Soon he and Lamin came into a clearing and saw 12 men dragging a dugout canoe with ropes. They had felled a tree and burned and chopped it out, and now they were starting to move it the long way to the river. After each haul on the ropes, they sang the next line of the song, each one ending, all together, then again, straining hard as they moved the dugout about another arm's length. Waving to the men, who waved back, Kunta passed them and made a mental note to tell Lamin later who these men were and why they had made the canoe from a tree that grew here in the forest rather than near the riverbank. They were from the village of Kirawan, where they made the best Mandinka dugouts, and they knew that only forest trees would float. Kunta thought with a rush of warmth about the 3 young men from Bara whom they were traveling to meet. It was strange that though they never had seen each other before, they seemed as brothers. Perhaps it was because they too were Mandinkas. They said things differently than he did, but they weren't different inside. Like them, he had decided to leave his village to seek his fortune and a little excitement before returning to their homes ahead of the next big rains. When the time neared for the Alansaro prayer in mid-afternoon, Kunta stepped off the trail where a small stream ran among trees. Not looking at Lamin, he slipped off his headload, flexed himself, and bent to scoop up handfuls of water in order to splash his face. He drank sparingly, then, in the midst of his prayer, he heard Lamin's headload thud to the earth. Springing up at the end of the prayer intending to rebuke him, he saw how painfully his brother was crawling toward the water. But Kunta still made his voice hard. "Sip a little at a time." As Lamin drank, Kunta decided that an hour's resting here would be long enough. After eating a few bites of food, he thought Lamin should be able to keep walking until time for the Fatiro prayer at about dusk, when a fuller meal and a night's rest would be welcomed by them both. But Lamin was too tired even to eat. He lay where he had drunk from the stream, face down with his arms flung out, palms up. Kunta stepped over quietly to look at the soles of his feet. They weren't bleeding yet. Then Kunta himself catnapped, and when he got up he took from his headload enough dried meat for two. Shaking Lamin awake, he gave him his meat and ate his own. Soon they were back on the trail, which made all the turns and passed all the landmarks the young men from Bara had drawn for Kunta. Near one village they saw two old grandmothers and two young girls with some first Kafo children, busily catching crabs, darting their hands into a little stream and snatching out their prey. Near dusk, as Lamin began to grab more and more often at his headload, Kunta saw ahead a flock of large bushfowl circling down to land. Abruptly he stopped, concealing himself, as Lamin sank onto his knees behind a bush nearby. Kunta pursed his lips, making the male bushfowl mating call, and shortly several fat, fine hens came flapping and waddling over. They were cocking their heads and looking around when Kunta's arrow went straight through one, jerking its head off. He let the blood drain out, and while the bird roasted, he built a rough bush shelter, then prayed. He also roasted some ears of wild corn that he had plucked along the way before awakening Lamin, who had fallen asleep again the moment they put their headloads down. Hardly had Lamin wolfed down his meal before he flopped back down onto the soft moss under a slanting roof of leafy boughs and went back to sleep without a murmur. Kunta sat hugging his knees in the night's still air. Not far away, hyenas began yipping. For some time, he diverted himself by identifying the other sounds of the forest. Then 3 times he faintly heard a melodious horn. He knew it was the next village's final prayer call, blown by their alimamo, through a hollowed elephant's tooth. He wished that Lamin had been awake to hear its haunting cry, which was almost like a human voice, but then he smiled, for his brother was beyond caring what anything sounded like. Then himself praying, Kunta also slept. Soon after sunrise, they were passing that village and hearing the drumming rhythm of the women's pestles pounding couscous for breakfast porridge. Kunta could almost taste it, but they didn't stop. Not far beyond, down the trail, was another village, and as they went by, the men were leaving their mosque and the women were bustling around their cooking fires. Still farther on, Kunta saw ahead of them an old man sitting beside the trail. He was bent nearly double over a number of cowrie shells, which he was shuffling and reshuffling on a plaited bamboo mat while mumbling to himself. Not to interrupt him, Kunta was about to pass by when the old man looked up and hailed them over to where he sat. "I come from the village of Kutakunda, which is in the kingdom of Wuli, where the sun rises over the Simbani forest," he said in a high, cracking voice. "And where may you be from?" Kunta told him the village of Jafur, and the old man nodded. "I have heard of it." He was consulting his cowries, he said, to learn their next message about his journey to the city of Timbuktu, which I want to see before I die, and he wondered if the travelers would care to be of any help to him. "We are poor, but happy to share whatever we have with you, grandfather," said Kunta, easing off his headload, reaching within it, and withdrawing some dried meat, which he gave the old man, who thanked him and put the food in his lap. Peering at them both, he asked, "You are brothers traveling?" "We are, grandfather," Kunta replied. "That is good," the old man said, and picked up 2 of his cowries. "Add this to those on your hunting bag, and it will bring you a fine profit," he said to Kunta, handing him one of the cowries. "And you, young man," he said to Lamin, giving him the other, "keep this for when you become a man with a bag of your own." They both thanked him, and he wished them Allah's blessings. They had walked on for quite a while when Kunta decided that the time was ripe to break his silence with Lamin. Without stopping or turning, he began to speak. "There is a legend, little brother, that it was traveling Mandinkas who named the place where that old man is bound. They found there a kind of insect they had never seen before and named the place Tumbo Kutu, which means new insect." When there was no response from Lamin, Kunta turned his head. Lamin was well behind, bent over his headload, which had fallen open on the ground, and struggling to tie it back together. As Kunta trotted back, he realized that Lamin's grabbing at his headload had finally caused it to work its bindings loose, and that he had somehow eased it off his head without making any noise, not wanting to break the rule of silence by asking Kunta to stop. While Kunta was retying the headload, he saw that Lamin's feet were bleeding, but this was to be expected, so he said nothing of it. The tears shone in Lamin's eyes as he got the load back on his head, and they went on. Kunta upbraided himself that he hadn't missed Lamin's presence and might have left him behind. They hadn't walked much farther when Lamin let out a choked scream. Thinking he had stepped on a thorn, Kunta turned and saw his brother staring upward at a big panther flattened on the limb they would have walked under in another moment. The panther went sss, then seemed to flow almost lazily into the branches of a tree and was gone from sight. Shaken, Kunta resumed walking, alarmed and angry and embarrassed at himself. Why had he not seen that panther? The odds were that it was only wishing to remain unseen and wouldn't have sprung down upon them, for unless the big cats were extremely hungry, they rarely attacked even their animal prey during the daylight, and humans seldom at any time, unless they were cornered, provoked, or wounded. Still, a picture flashed through Kunta's memory of the panther-mangled nanny goat from his goat-herding days. He could almost hear the Kintango's stern warning. The hunter's senses must be fine. He must hear what others cannot, smell what others cannot. He must see through the darkness. But while he had been walking along with his own thoughts wandering, it was Lamin who had seen the panther. Most of his bad troubles had come from that habit, which he absolutely must correct, he thought. Bending quickly without breaking pace, Kunta picked up a small stone, spit on it 3 times, and hurled it far back down the trail, the stone having thus carried behind them the spirits of misfortune. They walked on with the sun burning down upon them as the country gradually changed from green forest to oil palms and muddy, dozing creeks, taking them past hot, dusty villages where, just as in Jafur, first Kafo children ran and screamed around in packs, where men lounged under the baobab, and women gossiped beside the well. But Kunta wondered why they let their goats wander around these villages, along with the dogs and chickens, rather than keep them either out grazing or penned up, as in Jafur. He decided that they must be an odd, different kind of people. They pushed on over grassless, sandy soil, sprinkled with the burst, dry fruit of weirdly shaped baobabs. When the time came to pray, they rested and ate lightly, and Kunta would check Lamin's head bundle and his feet, whose bleeding was not so bad anymore, and the crossroads kept unfolding like a picture, until finally there was the huge old shell of a baobab that the young men from Bara had described. It must have been hundreds of rains old to be dying at last, he thought, and he told Lamin what one of the young men had told him. A griot rests inside there, adding from his own knowledge that griots were always buried not as other people were, but within the shells of ancient baobabs, since both the trees and the histories in the heads of griots were timeless. "We're close now," Kunta said, and he wished he had the drum he was going to make, so that he could signal ahead to his friends. With the sinking of the sun, they finally reached the clay pits, and there were the 3 young men. "We felt you would come," they shouted, happy to see him. They merely ignored Laman as if he were their own second Kafo brother. Amidst brisk talk, the 3 young men proudly showed the tiny grains of gold they had collected. By the next morning's first light, Kunta and Laman had joined in, chopping up chunks of sticky clay, which they dropped into large calabashes of water. After whirling the calabash, then slowly pouring off most of the muddy water, they carefully felt with their fingers to see if any gold grains had sunk to the bottom. Now and then there was a grain as tiny as a millet seed, or maybe a little larger. They worked so feverishly that there was no time for talk. Laman seemed even to forget his aching muscles in the search for gold, and each precious grain went carefully into the hollow of the largest quills from bush pigeons' wings, stoppered with a bit of cotton. Kunta and Laman had 6 quills full when the 3 young men said they'd collected enough. Now, they said, they'd like to go farther up the trail, deeper into the interior of the country, to hunt elephants' teeth. They said they had been told where old elephants sometimes broke off their teeth in trying to uproot small trees and thick brush while feeding. They had heard also that if one could ever find the secret graveyards of the elephants, a fortune in teeth would be there. Would Kunta join them? He was sorely tempted. This sounded even more exciting than hunting for gold, but he couldn't go, not with Laman. Sadly, he thanked them for the invitation and said he must return home with his brother. So warm farewells were exchanged, but not before Kunta had made the young men accept his invitation to stop for hospitality in Jafur on their way home to Bara. The trip back seemed shorter to Kunta. Laman's feet bled worse, but he walked faster when Kunta handed him the quills to carry, saying, "Your mother should enjoy these." Laman's happiness was no greater than his own at having taken his brother traveling, just as their father had done for him. Just as Laman would one day take Suwadu, and Suwadu would take Madi. They were approaching Jafur's traveler's tree when Kunta heard Laman's headload fall off again. Kunta whirled angrily, but then he saw his brother's pleading expression. "All right, get it later," he snapped. Without a word, his aching muscles and his bleeding feet forgotten, Laman bolted past Kunta for the village, his thin legs racing faster than they'd ever taken him. By the time Kunta entered the village gate, excited women and children were clustered around Binta, who was sticking the 6 quills of gold into her hair, clearly bursting with relief and happiness. A moment later, Binta's and Kunta's faces exchanged a look of tenderness and warmth, far beyond the usual greetings that passed between mother and her grown-up son home from traveling. The women's clacking tongues soon let everyone in Jafur know what the 2 oldest Kinti sons had brought home with them. "There's a cow on Binta's head," shouted an old grandmother. There was enough gold in the quills to buy a cow, and the rest of the women took up that cry. "You did well," said Amoro simply when Kunta met him, but the feeling they shared without further words was even greater than with Binta. In the days that followed, elders, seeing Kunta around the village, began to speak to him and smile in a special way, and he solemnly replied with his respects. Even Suwadu's little second Kafo mates greeted Kunta as a grown-up, saying peace, and then standing with palms folded over their chests until he passed by. Kunta even chanced to overhear Binta one day gossiping about the 2 men I feed, and he was filled with pride that his mother had finally realized he was a man. It was all right with Kunta now, not only for Binta to feed him, but even to do such things as searching on Kunta's head for ticks, as she had been resenting not doing. And Kunta felt it all right now also to visit her hut again now and then. As for Binta, she bustled about all smiles, even humming to herself as she cooked. In an offhand manner, Kunta would ask if she needed him to do anything. She would say so if she did, and he did whatever it was as soon as he could. If he but glanced at Laman or Suwadu when they were playing too loudly, for example, they were instantly still and quiet. and Kunta liked tossing Madi into the air, catching him as he fell, and Madi liked it even more. As for Lamin, he clearly regarded his man-brother as ranking second only to Allah. He cared for Kunta's 7 goats, which were multiplying well, as if they were goats of gold, and he eagerly helped Kunta to raise his small farm plot of couscous and ground nuts. Whenever Binta needed to get some work done around the hut, Kunta would take all 3 children off her hands, and she would stand smiling in her doorway as he marched off with Madi on his shoulder, Lamin following, strutting like a rooster, and Suwadu jealously tagging along behind. It was nice, thought Kunta, so nice that he caught himself wishing that he might have a family of his own like this someday. But not until the time comes, of course, he told himself, and that's a long way off.